Hello, welcome to the self-learning platform by Dr. Sushma Singh. Today we start our lecture on Unit 4 Liberty with topic Recent Debates on Liberty. Now that we have covered the traditional debate over the freedom between the negative and positive liberty advocates, let us look at some ideological positions which are tangential to this debate. We will now look at how feminism has grappled with the value of freedom. It had been claimed that freedom began its long journey in the Western consciousness as a woman's value. Peterson women constituted the first slaves in the period of rudimentary stage formation in the late 9th and 8th century BC. Greece, during the constant warfare between the aristocratic clan of that period, male prisoners of war were killed, while the women were enslaved. As the first slaves in early Greek society, women, both those who were actually slaves and those who lived in a dread of capture and enslavement, thought of and valued the condition anti-ethical to that of slavery, that of freedom. Peterson calls this ideal of freedom that emerged in the consciousness of the women of ancient Greece a conception of personal freedom. He points out, however, that it is different from the idea of negative freedom now familiar in the West. Ancient women were never satisfied with a purely negative view of personal freedom, not only because they recognized its potential, nihilism, and moral values, but because they could see how an unmasculated negative liberty easily sublated into liberty as power over others. As slaves, ancient Greek women imagined being able to assert their own will once they were free. But as women slaves, they visualized the state of freedom not as the domination of the will of others, but as a state to be shared with others. For them, freedom was love, a condition of being resorted to their kinsfolk and families. This concern with an alternative woman's conception of freedom has become dominant in the writings of the post 1960s woman movement in the West, especially in the work of some women psychological thinkers on the differential impact of mother dominated parenting on little boys and girls. The mother, who is the primary caretaker, represents the entire world outside the self, that is, the object world, to all infants, and the relationship with his or her mother determines a child's response to others in the world. The infant stands towards itself and the world all derive in the first instance from this earliest relationship. In these first few years of life, human infants go through different phases: symbiosis, separation, and individualization in their relationship with their mother. Male and female infants in a patriarchal culture experience these phases differently because their mother, for psychological and sociological reasons, respond to them differently. Mothers are able, for instance, to more easily encourage the separation and individualization of their sons, while being less willing to give up the symbiotic phase with respect to their daughters. In addition, little boys soon learn to fear their primary identification with their mothers because they realize that their male identity is defined as not being like a female. These psychological processes have an effect on their relationship with others in general. The attainment of masculine gender identity involves denial of attachment or relationship. This process of psychological development in childhood has been used to explain adult male responses. For example, the apparent male perception of all relationships as threatening and their sense of freedom as the absence of the other. By doing so, it also problematizes the prevalent norms for selfhood and autonomy, which are supposed to be based on the experiences of men. It is misguided to conceptualize the realization of autonomy or freedom as required the absence of others. The development of autonomy takes place in interaction with other slaves, and therefore freedom needs to be conceptualized in terms other than non interference. Another leading feminist scholar, Carol Patterman, also seeks to tell a new story of freedom. Critical of American socialized psychological theory, she nevertheless shares its concern with constructing an alternative conception of freedom, a possibility she argues that depends on our giving up the lure of social contract theory with its myth of the individual as owning property in his person. Efforts to construct women's freedom have remained unsatisfactory, she explains, because most feminists failed to see that modern society is based not only on a social but also a sexual contract. The original contract created not just a civil society but a patriarchal civil society because the contract was between men to, among other things, enjoy equal sexual access to women. This resulted in men's freedom and women's subjugation. Civil freedom remains a masculine attribute. The original contract was simultaneously a social sexual slave contract, and if one focuses merely on its social aspect, one cannot see how women cannot be free in a society based on it. Patterman is thus a critic of contract and claims that women's freedom can be constructed only by giving up the language of contract. This language encourages a conception of individuals as having property in their person, and its corollary is to see freedom as independence, especially the independence of participating in the labor market. Pettyman continues this argument in a late piece, arguing that freedom as independence should be transformed into freedom as autonomy, a freedom that is secured through the recognition of the interdependence of all citizens. The above discussion referred to the treatment of freedom in one specific ideological tradition. If we, however, look at another ideological position, for instance, the liberal communitarian debate, we can see similar controversies about the meaning of individual liberty. Now let us sum up the unit. The idea of liberty as everyone's birthright is certainly the gift of modernity, no matter how far it may be from being realized. The recent discussions on liberty have focused on the relationship between individual liberty and our social independence. It is not by ignoring this social independence, but by acknowledging it, that we can construct an adequate conception of individual liberty. Here we want to wind up this lecture, and thank you so much for your attention.